Many of history's turning points started with a man, a gun, and a ball of metal. From the shot heard around the world at Lexington to the bullet that flew through President Kennedy's skull, violence has been a vehicle advancing Western civilization for centuries. Europe's history was one of petty rivalry and war, where power equated to virtue and negotiation equated to weakness. Warring kingdoms became warring nations and peoples became countries, but through all, the bitterness remained. As the world progressed forward, the guise of sensibility began to wear once more. And on a fateful day, in June 1914, another one of history's great volleys occurred. This would be more than a shot heard around the world. This would be the shot to go through it. It's hard to say where the origin of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination came into being, but nationalism was surely the cause. Italy and Germany had recently unified into nation-states, with Bulgaria close behind. The belief that each people should have a state of their own came into conflict with the controversial, rigid borders of Europe. Serbia had fought a war with Bulgaria in 1885, which proved to be an embarrassing defeat for the nation. The Serbian army was defamed for their loss, losing power and funding with each passing year. The army, who had fought this war for their people, was instead ridiculed for their efforts in a near-pointless war. The ridicule came to a head when Dragutin Dimitrievich, a Serbian officer, conspired with 120 junior officers to enact vengeance on the king for weakening his defenders. On June 1903, 28 of them would cut off communication from the palace. From there, they dismembered the king and queen and defenestrated them. They then instituted the king's brother as the new monarch of Serbia. Years later, in 1911, Dimitrijević, often called Apis, had a new objective: to unite all Serbians under a state of their own. He formed a covert operation. Under their constitution, they carried the name Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, in English, unification or death. Serbians, though there was a state bearing this name, lived in many states throughout the Balkans, including Bosnia. Bosnia was not one of these nation-states. In fact, it boasted a diverse population. The Serbs in Bosnia were keen on the idea of Serbian unification, but the empires surrounding Bosnia had other ideas. Years before, in 1908, Austria-Hungary had illegally annexed Bosnia, seizing it under their borders. The encroachment was by all means a power move. Russia wanted access to the Black Sea, while the Ottoman Empire had legal claims to the territory. To prevent a war with the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary then formally paid 2.2 million lira for the land. That's around 2.4 million current American dollars. To gain the trust of the Bosnians in the acquired territory, the people of Bosnia were granted full Austro-Hungarian citizenship because of the annexation. Europe, which was prepared for a violent conflict between neighbors, quickly settled down after this accord was reached. Serbia, however, was furious that there were now Serbs locked behind another state's borders. Years later, when the Ujedinjenje ili Smrt was founded, Bosnia became their target. It turns out that a group of Bosnians were against their state's assimilation into Austria-Hungary and were willing to get their hands dirty to do it. This multi-ethnic resistance force was known as Young Bosnia. In fact, many of them were truly young. The assassins were barely either out of their teens or still in them. What's so interesting is that these two groups were able to form a partnership so amicably. Their ideologies in many ways did not align. If Bosnia became an independent state, like the young Serbians were fighting to accomplish, then the Serbs inside would still be separated by the same border, just under a different name. Firstly, their constitution commanded it. Article 4 clearly states that the organization will give every assistance to those nations and organizations who are fighting for their own national liberation and unification. In addition, young Bosnia's diversity could be used to the UIS's advantage. If the entire resistance was Serbian, the organization's involvement in the alliance would be quickly discovered. The mix of Croats, Bosnians, Turks, and Serbians would add complexity to the alliance's arsenal. It's worth noting that Apis would rather risk the lives of those not part of the Serbian nation if possible, or he'd be putting his own people at risk.
Now that the organization had their inside job, their new objective was to find their angle of attack. The UIS needed to carefully orchestrate their assault to divorce Bosnia from Austria-Hungary, and they found that there was a central figure on which the empire solely relied. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, as the king had no next of kin. The old king had little hope of producing progeny of his own, and it seemed he was on the back nine of his life. When the organization learned that Ferdinand would arrive in Sarajevo in June 1914, the assassination plan was officially set in motion. Young Bosnia hired a group of Bosnian Serbs to carry out the murder. Among them were Gavrilo Princip and Nedeljko Kabrinović. The assassins were taken into Serbia and trained with bombs, grenades, and pistols. In May, they were sent to Bosnia to intercept the Archduke, with orders to ingest cyanide in case of failure. Unfortunately, the Serbian government heard of the plan, so the Prime Minister, caught between his allegiance to the people and the safety of the continent, gave a minimal effort to stop the assassins, and then gently warned Austria-Hungary after the assassins escaped into the country.
June 18th, the Archduke entered a motorcade that was to deliver him to Sarajevo's city center. Along the way, the car encountered 7 assassins, only one of whom engaged. Kabrinović threw a bomb at the Archduke, but he deflected it before it exploded, and the car behind him and 12 surrounding bystanders were hit instead. After this, the other assassins decided not to act, as they simply believed Kabrinovic's attack had succeeded. Or so they thought. Kabrinović was unable to escape the scene, and he desperately searched for a way out. He saw a nearby river, swallowed his cyanide, and leaped into it. His escape plan was further complicated by 2 factors. For starters, his cyanide had expired, so instead of killing him, it caused him to vomit. This was after he had realized that the river he jumped into was only inches deep at most, breaking both of his legs. From a historical standpoint, it's remarkable these assassins were able to complete their objective. A twist of fate would give the Black Hand a second chance. After his speech, the Archduke planned a detour to avoid more potential assassins. He sought to backtrack to the hospital to see the people that were injured by Kabrinovic's bomb. However, he did not inform his driver of his decision, and when the driver finally discovered that his route had changed, the car stalled as he stopped. 5 feet away was Gavrilo Princip, reeling from his previous failure. Immediately, Princip rushed the car, firing 2 bullets at the Archduke, one accidentally hitting his wife and killing her in the process. Princip was quickly restrained, but the damage was done. The couple was rushed the rest of the way to the hospital, but the staff was unable to save them. The assassins, though successful, met just as cruel a fate as the Archduke. Kabrinović and Princip narrowly avoided execution, being just below the minimum age of 20, but the 2 rotted in prison and died of tuberculosis just a few years later. Apis would not live on to capitalize on his deeds. In 1917, he was executed by the Serbian government for treason against his own people, an ironic sentence for his attempt to unify them. There were no winners here. Both sides made crippling blunders, with Austria-Hungary's being just slightly more critical. Ultimately, Serbia and Austria-Hungary were not even central powers in the World War that followed. The claiming hands that ended Austria-Hungary's heir also cut the taut cords binding Europe together. In fact, it only took 30 days for a full-scale war to break out in Europe, eventually spreading chaos throughout the world. After the Germans sided with Austria-Hungary, they employed what was coined the Schlieffen Plan, named after General Alfred von Schlieffen, in which Germany would quickly invade neutral Belgium. This led to the entry of Britain, France, and Russia as what would become the Triple Entente. Eventually, the US joined the alliance in 1917 to help finish the war. The Allied victory and Treaty of Versailles crippled Germany economically and turned it into the Weimar Republic. The new Weimar Republic was forced to pay vast amounts in reparations to the Allies, partly due to the strong sense of revanchism in France, ever since the humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War just decades before. These reparations exacerbated the inflation crisis in Germany during this time. This constant hatred and desire for retaliation drove the German people to desperation and allowed for the rise of the radical Nazi Party and its leader, Adolf Hitler, who would further turn the world upside down in what would become World War II. If Princip had never shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the world would have been spared from what most consider the gravest atrocities ever committed.